So this webinar, as Sarah said, is on the effect of climate change on pest populations, and really the focus is going to be on that practical approach of how do we deal with this. So we'll go and we'll talk about, firstly, the project under which this is funded, climate variability, climate change. What is this? What's happening? We'll talk a bit about how pest populations change and that practical approach, as we've said. All right. So the project that this is funded has a number of different aspects, and you can read the title here. It's a nursery levy-funded project where we are producing fact sheets, pest management plans, various other documents for industry. It has a large diagnostics component, which is through Grow Help that Sarah mentioned. We basically, production nurseries get a subsidised rate or free diagnostics if you're NIAS accredited. There are education components in terms of workshops and webinars each year. Now this year, given the unique circumstances, we have only had webinars so that we don't have to travel under the COVID circumstances. And then we also provide biosecurity support to industry. Most of the documents, or actually all of the documents and the webinars that we have produced are at the FMS website. So if you can just raise your hand if you have used that FMS website, downloaded our fact sheets, other fact sheets that are there. Yeah, I'm seeing a few hands get raised. That's great. Australia has an awesome nursery farm management system. I would encourage you to look at this website. If you are looking for information, thank you, I've lowered your hands. Use this, the farm management, the nursery production FMS website. Use the search function. A lot of websites, the search functions don't work. I'm quite pleased to say that the search function works. So even if you can't find the specific topic, type it in, whether it's water disinfestation or aphids or something like a pathogen, botrytis, anything that you're looking for, type it in the search, and hopefully a number of documents will come up that will help you. So take advantage of that. All right, so on to the next area. We're going to cover these two sections together in this next bit. So first of all, there are some jargon words out there, and we're just going to clarify. So the weather, that's what we experience every day. It's pretty straightforward. It's short term. Whereas climate variability, we all know the climate this year is different from last year, this season different from last season. It's more long term, and oftentimes it's averaged so that you can actually sort of get an idea of the trends. And it's how those elements, whether it's temperature, humidity, max daily temperature, minimum daily temperature, or whatever happens to be most relevant, how those things have changed over time. Whereas climate change is more within a framework of statistically significant changes over time, whether it be temperature or any of those other elements that we mentioned previously, or other ones altogether. And it's also a long-term thing. So climate change is summarizing, it's basically very similar to climate variability, but with that undertones of a statistically significant change. So what we're going to do is talk about historical climate change, because this has been measured. No one really has a crystal ball. There are lots of models. But we're going to look at historical things to show that climate is changing. I think most people can see that. And this information is based on what is provided at the Bureau of Meteorology. And they do a report every 2 years, and it has a lot of information. So if you're interested in more details, have a look. there's a lot there to get your head around. So this is the sort of thing that's been happening in the last 100 years or so, since we've been having fairly good records of climate data. So there's been a 1 degree increase since 1910 in air temperature and surface sea temperature. The air temperature and sea temperature, the surface sea temperature, are intimately linked, as we'll talk about later. There's been a global sea level increase by about 20 centimeters. The oceans, with increasing CO2, oceans are acidifying slightly. So the CO2 change into an acid in the ocean, and pH therefore decreases. There's been a long-term increase in fire weather, so periods of hot, dry days. There has been reduced rainfall, and this has been across the southeast and southwest of Australia. And what I did is look at this winter and this summer. So in the winter, it's been more dry across the bottom. In summer, we're seeing greater intensity of the wet season, of rainfall in the wet season. So we're getting more extreme rain and drought events. And there's actually been reduced cyclone frequency. Okay, so oceans. Oceans play a critical role in climate, and apparently the oceans absorb about 90% of the air temperature and energy that comes in, or is in the air. So the oceans effectively cushion the global warming effect. So the surface water obviously collects most of the energy, and then there are vertical currents which take that heat lower into the ocean. There have been increases at the surface and at depth. There have been increased ocean heat waves. So these are for periods of time where the oceans are relatively warm, and the combination of the heat waves and decreased pH have been linked to coral bleaching, in increased frequencies of coral bleaching. And as we said before, there's increased sea level, and most of the sea level increase is actually, apparently, I'm just quoting here, has been from the fact that warmer water takes up more space. So on a global level, when all of the water just takes up that tiny bit more space, there's a raise in the sea temperature and sea level, and then the rest of it has been attributed to ice caps melting. So there's just more water. Okay, so appreciate that is a historical overview. There are lots of models that effectively continue these sorts of trends. I wanted to focus on the past. These things are measured. You can't, it's very difficult to argue with historical data so I just figured, let's focus on what we know and assume that something similar is going to change, and at least our lifetime sort of thing. So, on to the effect of climate change and plant growth. So as we've said, the projection is that there's going to be a continued increase in CO2, and plants may actually perform better, particularly C3 photosynthesizing plants. So the studies which have been done in cabinets, and sometimes even in open air, in these sorts of sophisticated experiments where they're actually releasing CO2 to increase the CO2 in that plot, and then they're measuring plant growth parameters. So there may be increased photosynthesis, increased carbohydrates and biomass, but then also reduced foliar nitrogen. There have been some studies indicate that there are changes in protein concentrations, particularly in grain, that may be associated with a reduced quality of that grain. Some studies show that there's increased root growth and changes in root architecture. The main point is that different studies show different responses across plant species. So it's very difficult to then generalize to say that all of them are going to do this or that. There's going to be some plants that will respond great and others that maybe not so well. Okay, so how are pest and pathogen populations going to change? There are some models that say some fairly cataclysmic things, and I couldn't resist this meme, so I apologize if I found it amusing. Anyway, what is being predicted is that there's, owing to increased temperature, there's going to be reduced generation time for pests, which might mean that they are more able to rapidly increase. There's predictions of a poleward migration, so for Australia from north to south, and increasing distributions. There's predictions of increased disease outbreaks and reduced pesticide efficacy in unstable environments. This is because there's more extreme weather events. I personally find that one hard to swallow, but if there are increased rainfall events, then potentially that is a possibility, as indicated in this last point. So certainly for some pests in some crops, maybe some of these things will be an issue. But I tend to think that the outlook isn't as bad as that, hopefully. But let's look at some more specific examples where people have stuck insects in a cabinet or in those open air with increased carbon dioxide or other aspects that are simulating the conditions that are predicted under climate change scenarios. So for potato aphids, they measured increased reproductive rates in increased CO2. But they also measured a reduced alarm response. So that may mean the alarm response being drop off the plant. So if there's a parasitoid coming along, they don't release their alarm pheromones as much, they don't drop off the plant as much, so perhaps there will be increased parasitism. The point there is that these things are complicated, so it's hard to have a real knowledge of what could potentially happen. So there's been some studies suggesting that barley infected with barley yellow dwarf virus has increased titer under increased CO2, and the suggestion is maybe the outbreaks will be worse. Some models predict lower pest pressure from increased weather events, increased extreme weather events, whether that be extreme heat or extreme rains weather events. Some insects may actually feed more, particularly the chewing insects that have been studied, like caterpillars. There's decreased foliar nitrogen, therefore perhaps they're going to feed more. Studies with hemipteran pests have suggested that there's increased survival and abundance. So these are your aphids, whiteflies, those sorts of insects. What we have to keep in mind is what I alluded to up here, is most of the experimentation that has been done is around a single variable. They're just increasing CO2 or one or maybe a small number of variables, and it's really hard to then extrapolate that into a real-world situation. The real-world situation, which may be increased temperature or increased CO2 and various other variables. So without not being able to predict the future as such, it's difficult to say what is actually going to happen. What we do know is that pest and pathogen populations are always changing. And pests and pathogens track environmental conditions that are favorable. In a favorable year, they do very well. They potentially can be an outbreak situation. If you've got a susceptible host, the pathogen is present and the favorable environment, you get more disease than if you have resistant or don't have the host present at all. We've all seen, well, hopefully we have all seen these pest triangles. Same with pests. If you've got the pest, the right conditions and the right crop, your incidence and or severity of that pest is going to be worse. There was a study done just on this point down here, study done in the grains over about 3 decades, where they looked at the historical climate and the historical pests present in those crops. And what they found was the pests were not so much, the pest incidents and outbreaks populations weren't so influenced by climate so much as by management actions of that crop, whether that be changes in pesticides being applied or crop management techniques that have changed or variety choice. So that in itself is an important point that we need to keep in mind, regardless of the climate, whatever climate you are going to be experiencing, your crop management is critical. It's also important to realize that pests and pathogens can't respond to future conditions. They might look like they have little satellite dishes as antennae, but they can only respond to current conditions. So they're not going to go, oh, this area is going to be great. In 10 years' time, I'm going to hang out here. That's not how things work. They respond to the current conditions. If it's good conditions, their populations are going to go up. If it's bad conditions, they're going to go down. And the distribution will potentially spread. What's more important in terms of that distribution, I feel, is how we move plants around and how we move plant pests around. To me, that is the more critical factor than the natural changes in distribution, which also does occur. But overall, I feel human movement of pests is of more importance. So therefore, based on all that information, the only real conclusion we can come to is that some pests are going to increase in pressure with time and become worse problems, and others are going to decrease. I'm sorry that that's really kind of a very broad and perhaps not all that helpful conclusion, but it's the only one that I can reasonably say and be confident in saying. So with that, do we have any questions? Sarah, questions?
Doesn't look like we've got any questions coming up. Must it maybe a convincing
convincing or unconvincing, not willing to say? All right. If you have comments, put them out there and perhaps we can at least share those comments. Thanks, Colin. So far all makes sense. That's great. All right. Well, we'll keep on moving, and this webinar probably will finish early. I wasn't sure if we were going to have a lot of discussion or minimal, as we seem to be getting now. All right, we'll keep moving. Okay. So within a framework of some pests are going to increase and some are going to decrease, the practical approach to mitigate the risk under whatever happens next, that's what we're going to talk about now. Okay. But first of all, climate change isn't new. Climate's always been changing. And we're really not going to go into the causes of climate change here. It's going to be a complex issue. From your business's perspective, and in terms of managing pests, the causes are actually irrelevant. What is relevant to your business is how you manage the change in pest pressures over time. So we're going to digress to a little thought exercise. And some of you that have been along to the workshops that we've been may recognize a slightly altered version of this that we used. So for any particular topic or area of your life, there are a few different states that you can be in. What we know that we know, so these are the things that you go, okay, I've got information, I've formed an opinion, it's based on these assumptions. What we know that we don't know, so I know that I'm a terrible mechanic. I take my car to the mechanic, he fixes it, it's great. What we don't know that we know, this one's a little bit complicated and it takes a little while to get your head around, but we'll put it into a framework within a pest management business sense. It's hopefully practical. And then what we don't know that we don't know. And these are the things that rear their ugly head and you go, oh, oops. So from within a pest management perspective, from a production nursery perspective, what we don't know that we don't know, these are the outbreaks. Oops. And potentially we're selling infested plants that we think are healthy, but they actually have an infestation because we didn't look. What we don't know that we know, these sorts of things can happen when staff as a business aren't communicating. So maybe there's your people, they're doing their work, they've realized that there's a problem, they've realized something, but as a business, we didn't do our job very well and communicate it to the people that actually have to manage that pest, whether that be to put on biocontrol agents or to apply a pesticide or to actually discard those plants or to quarantine them, whatever it happens to be, that didn't happen. What we know that we don't know. Okay, so we acknowledged that we haven't managed to get out there and look at those plants. So we know that that's a space that's a risk. We know that we don't know what's going on there. We're going to mitigate that risk by going and having a look or sending someone else to go and have a look or some other action to make sure that your plants are healthy. And I'm sure, as you can imagine, this last one, what we know that we know is based on monitoring. You get data on what's there, what's not there, the health of your crop generally, so that hopefully you are selling healthy plants. All right, so as I've alluded to here, the solution to climate change from a pest management perspective for a nursery production business is monitoring. Monitor for your pests, monitor for diseases, monitor for crop health. And as you've probably all heard, monitoring is the foundation of integrated crop management or integrated pest management, integrated disease management. But I like integrated crop management as a term because it's more holistic. It's treating the whole scenario, not just the pests and diseases, but the growing conditions, the other abiotic or the soil conditions, the water, the site situation so that you can produce a healthy crop. I hope you don't mind the dad joke. I made it up myself. That's why it's not that good. Anyway, the benefits of monitoring. Monitoring detects plant growth problems early. And some of you that have been to our workshops in the past will have heard us go on about monitoring and recording your data many times. But we're going to do it again because it makes sense within a climate change situation. When you so monitoring, detecting the problem early means that it's easier to manage that problem. You have fewer discards, reduced management costs. You're more likely to establish the source of the problem and then be able to take actions accordingly. Did it come from your supplier? Did it come from the mother stock? Did it come from the neighboring plants? And then you can make the appropriate management actions. Monitoring is the benchmark for establishing successful management. So if you know what happened at time X and you apply whatever management techniques, then at time Y, there's an increase or a decrease, or it stays the same. You can make a judgment as to how well those actions have worked and build that into a management plan. And we have produced a nursery paper, on how to build your own management plan for your business, so it's personalized. It helps you to identify resistant and susceptible varieties. And knowing susceptible varieties can be very helpful so that you can potentially use those plants as sentinel plants, whether they are crop plants or just individual plants, so that you can then have greater monitoring effort on those susceptible plants, those high-risk plants during those high-risk periods. It also helps you establish the seasonal peaks. Okay, you might find that you are getting your outbreaks in 1 month, but really the lower populations are occurring 2 months prior to that. That sort of information is very helpful so that you can then put in your management early and never have the peak outbreak situation. Okay, so we're going to make a comment on active versus passive monitoring, because there are many people that we talk to that rely on passive monitoring. And I'm not saying, anyway, I'll keep going. Active monitoring is where you have specifically gone out and examined plant health. You assess the frequency of pests and diseases, assess crop health. Whereas passive monitoring, it's also helpful. It relies on the detection of a problem while completing other jobs. So that's your staff there. They're doing weeding. They are moving plants around. They're potting up. They are picking plants for dispatch. This is valuable information that you want to tie into, because the more people that you have looking, the better. But relying on passive monitoring can lead to greater pest populations. It's harder to find low-level populations. So if we think back to our thought exercise, the active monitoring is know that we know. It's going out there and making sure that we know, whereas the passive monitoring has a general framework of don't know that we don't know, and it's a discovery until it becomes so big that you can't possibly miss it. Okay, so how much should we monitor? The suggestion is make sure that you monitor all incoming stock at least once, perhaps more, depending on the risk of that crop. Is it a very susceptible crop? Is it fairly tolerant? Assign greater monitoring effort to high-risk plants, and particularly during high-risk seasons. So in general, weekly monitoring is good, but modify based on pest pressure, the season, the crop. and there's more information. We're not going to go into a lot of detail on monitoring because there's loads of information on the Nursery FMS website and in all the fact sheets on various different pests and pest management plans that we have done. We include a section on how to monitor for those pests. So we don't need to go into that here. The summary is climate's always going to change. Pest populations are also always going to change. And monitoring identifies current populations and problems and allows you to manage those early. So, do we have questions now, Sarah?
Yes, we have a few questions. The first one is about pests and their natural enemies or beneficials. As they increase together or in a lag, will they not be balanced once overall if climate change happens?
Okay, so pests tend to track their host plants and favorable conditions. So if you imagine that pest triangle, or the triangle with your host, your environment, and the pest, host, and environment, the pest will increase when all three of those are good. The same thing happens for predators. If the pest, the host, isn't present, or it's the wrong environmental conditions, the predator isn't going to increase. So, and what tends to occur is that there is a lag between a pest population increasing and the predator's population increasing. So, are they balanced? In an agricultural setting, it doesn't really, balanced rarely seems to happen. And particularly when you start throwing pesticides in the mix, where predators tend to be more susceptible than the pest, yeah, I tend to think that you're not going to have a balanced situation. Do you have some comments on that, Sarah, perhaps from a disease perspective?
It's probably, yeah, pretty similar, I would say. Yes.
Right.
That they will generally follow each other unless they have quite different temperature requirements. But often you pick, if you're using them as beneficials, then they're picked because they are very similar to the diseases that you're trying to manage. Okay, we have another question here. More damage by a pest is due to low foliar nitrogen, or is it more about the high metabolism rate in the pest and increased digestion with the increase in temperature?
It's a good question. From what I read, I understood that the lower nitrogen meant that the quality of the food was lower for, I'm pretty sure it was caterpillars in that they were studying mainly. So when the food quality is lower, they tend to feed more to get that extra nutrient that they require. However, there are interactions with increased temperature, which mean that, you know, the development time is faster, and so there will be a higher rate of feeding. So yes, it's not simple, and there are some interactions there that that can make it so that it goes both ways. Hopefully that answers the question well enough for you.
And we have another question. How do you effectively monitor plants in large nurseries, as regular monitoring is very time consuming and expensive?
Okay, so nurseries that are large, Larger nurseries have more staff in general, so then it's a matter of delegating effectively. I've known some nurseries that schedule, okay, I'm going to monitor this area of the nursery today, this area on that day, on certain days, so that they get around the entire nursery over a week or over a 2-week period. You also, as you're building your management plan, you know what pests are more or less important, so you can assign that monitoring effort to the ones that to the crops that are most at risk at particular periods of time. So yeah, it's a balancing act. However, and when you are monitoring and employing IPM, there tends, as you move from, let's say, using pesticides to pesticides within a IPM framework, you shift more time to that monitoring and less time to spraying.
The next question. I'm sorry, are you ready?
I'm just reading a comment from Andy. Yeah, so he has a large nursery, and basically he's indicating that they dedicate Mondays for the growers to monitor, and they had to change their thought processes, their management of staff and nursery practice to make sure that that happened. And then I presume, putting words in your mouth, Andy, that meant the rest of the week you could put into place any management actions that you needed to employ. All right, well, Sarah, next question, as you said.
Yeah, there's one that says, is there any climate change effect on target insects, for example, fruit fly, blowfly or mosquito, and the field application of sterile insect technique, and then an added bit near coastal areas?
I have no idea, I'm sorry. On the fruit fly situation, I mean, we're already seeing changes in temperature that seem to facilitate more of a southern distribution happening. But in terms of application of sterile insect technique, I think it'd be worth researching what studies have been done on sterile insect technique to see how it might apply to climate change scenarios. That's more specific than I can answer. Yeah, I'm sorry.
And that seems to be it as far as questions go.
All right. Okay. In which case, the last thing to say is this webinar will be made available on the GIA YouTube channel, and I'll send a link to that playlist in an email soon, and that there will also be a link to the survey. So if you could fill in that survey, it gives us good feedback and it helps to understand how the webinar has impacted your business. So and you can always email us at growhelp@daf. The email you see there if you have further questions. All right. Well, thank you, Sarah, and thank you everyone for attending. Until next time, thank you. We're going to close the webinar. Okay, bye-bye.